Thank you very much, Glenda. Thank you. And thank you to the Bureau Organising Committee as well. It's a real pleasure to be here. On the programme, I think I'm down as a representative of Queens, but just to tell you that Queens aren't claiming me, and Early Years said that they're not claiming me either. Well, that's a bit lucky because I think I'm going to be a free spirit this morning and I'm allowed to say what I want to say without being trammelled by organisational policy. I think this is a very timely event given where we are, but what I wanted to do here this morning is to reflect on, I suppose, where we've come from in Northern Ireland and describe some of the unique features of the system of early childhood care and education within Northern Ireland. I also want to think about how we've been influenced both from our own position but also some of the influences that we, especially in the voluntary and independent sector, have taken from elsewhere. And then in the spirit of optimism and hope, think about what are the opportunities for us now? As many of you will know, we've just had a new assembly agreed and a new framework, a new decade, a new approach. And I will propose that within that there's a need for a transformation fund to support the professional development of a workforce here in Northern Ireland. But I want to start with the importance of context, and it's a little quote from a very good friend of mine. Text without context is mere pretext. And again, I am going to constantly reinforce the importance of our context, that while there are many influences from the rest of the UK, Northern Ireland has had a unique and very different development from the rest of the UK and also have had different challenges. I want to start as well with a few quotes. And when he said this, when GB Gordon Brown said this at the beginning of the 21st century, we thought, yes, there is going to be eventually a commitment in this new century to a policy that will see investment in early years. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but we've been sadly disappointed. And then I thought I would share the complete opposite of that, a quote from the Swedish system. Enrolling children aged 1 in full daycare preschool services has now become accepted as a norm in Sweden. What was once viewed as the privilege of the rich or the institution of the needy or the single parent has become, after 70 years of political vision and policy making, an unquestionable right for children and families. Parents in Sweden now expect and get a holistic form of early childhood care, education, which includes healthcare, nurturing and education. And I think that's an important frame for us. Unfortunately, we're a long way from that perspective, from that political will and political vision, and indeed a long way of the understanding of the importance of holistic development from conception right through to the end of the first stage of early childhood. And finally, another view of childhood which I think should also underpin our thinking as professionals, as educators in the field of early childhood. And this one from Loris Malaguzzi, the founder of the Reggio Emilia system, what our view of childhood and children should be. The rich child born with the 100 languages, the child as an active protagonist, a citizen, a subject of rights, a constructor of knowledge and identity, a being living an important part of life course now, not just a becoming, waiting somehow in the antechamber of adulthood. So those perspectives, I think, are really important in terms of then how we think of ourselves as professionals. I said to them at the table, and they thought, oh my God, we're in for a history lesson here. But again, context is important. And I thought I would share with you, and it was very useful preparing for today, because it made me think and look back and read of some of the policy developments, some of the important policy developments that have influenced the shape of early childhood services here. And I suppose I would start by saying that since partition, and very much influenced by other developments in the rest of the UK, influences from the Macmillans and Isaacs, also from the Montessori movement, we in Northern Ireland began with a very strong holistic nursery system which incorporated care and education. In the 30s and 40s, most of the nurseries that were developed, they were birth to school age, and they incorporated this notion of care and education. They were focused on tackling poverty, and in the main then, especially during the period of the Second World War, aimed at enabling women to support the war effort. But unfortunately, after the war, we didn't have that political vision and commitment. And indeed, during the 50s and early 60s, we had a period of stasis and lack of development. But in the 60s, influenced by developments from New Zealand, we had the development of a very strong voluntary and community sector. But unfortunately, that's when we began to see the separation between care and education. The development, the 1968 Childcare Act really hardened a system of those in the voluntary and independent sector would be regulated by the health and care system, while those in education would fall under the education system. Our troubles brought significant development, mainly nursery schools in areas of disadvantage. And again, some of us are old enough in the room to remember one bright spark in that period, Lord Melchett, who interestingly was a minister for both education and health. He developed a policy, daycare and early education, which you should read because it was ahead of its time, wanting again to remove that separate system and incorporate a holistic approach to care and education. He lasted a very short time as minister. The Labour government fell, Melchett left politics, and the rest, I suppose, is history, because the 1980s and the early 1990s was a period of lack of investment, lack of policy, and a further deepening of the divisions between care and education. And in that, an approach where we saw the development of vocational qualifications and academic qualifications taking a different route. I mentioned the ceasefires because, again, in the context of Northern Ireland, they were very important. And I suppose for the first time, the European Union saw that the early childhood sector and its workforce could play a critical, important role in the building of peace and reconciliation. And indeed, from those early days, the European Union have been the main contributor to workforce development in Northern Ireland, with 60 million to date on qualifications and professional development. But that period also coincided, as you know, with the new Labour government policy and a new commitment from the Labour government that they would fund provision in the voluntary, community and statutory sectors. In 1998, we had our first real childcare policy, which was about trying to reinvigorate the Melchett daycare and education policy. That policy, 1998 to 2004, unfortunately has been the last childcare policy that we've really had. And there have been a number of reasons for that. But in looking at that policy, there was a wonderful commitment again to a policy for children that was based a lot within the principles of the Good Friday Agreement: social justice, equality, quality, accessibility and affordability. A recognition that the sector was changing, an investment in after-school provision, an investment in the preschool expansion programme, an investment in Sure Start, an investment in family support. And I suppose for us as well, and this is where I think we have differed very much from the rest of the UK, the voluntary and independent sector were in a position to argue for the leadership role of an early years specialist pedagogue, both within settings and supporting settings. The rest of the UK, those funded within the preschool expansion programme as it was then, had to be teachers. So this was a significant development, bringing again the voluntary and independent sector back into a position of partnership with the other part of the education system, the nursery school and nursery class system. So where are we now? And we've had 20 years, I think, with limited policy vision and policy investment. And a lot of what has happened has been bottom up as opposed to top down. But, there are positives and there are challenges. I think we have a mixed and varied range of services for 0 to 14. But some of those have more priority than others. I think we still haven't given enough commitment to the first 1,000 days. I think the 3 to 4 age group is doing fairly well, and then limited policy options and funding options for the 5+. The quality within the preschool sector is, I think, held by everybody as being solid and has been backed up by both the Chief Inspector of Education's report and indeed the EPNI report. We've had the development of some new provision within and outside Sure Start for 2-year-olds, but again, it's patchy and uneven. We feel that the role of the early years specialist has an awful lot to offer and has been equated with the growth in quality, both within services and as part of the mentoring approach. We've had a growing graduate profession, and indeed a recent audit by the Department of Education has shown us that 78% in the voluntary and independent sector are now at graduate level, as well as the graduate-led workforce within the state sector. And just think about that. That's a sector that has been totally committed to its own professional development. They haven't been funded. There has been no real policy aspiration that would happen, and yet within the profession there has been an enormous bottoms-up approach. And 78% at degree level, I haven't the percentage, but we also have a master's and PhD-led workforce. Unfortunately, there is variable quality in many of the vocational and apprenticeship routes to qualification, but a welcome development in some of the new workforce academies led by the local councils. And that's not to criticise the providers of the qualifications. I think we're in a system where numbers matter, where targets have to be met, and indeed it's not always the right people with the right attitudes who are joining some of the vocational qualifications. But unfortunately, we as employers are then seeing the end result of that, where we're faced with people who have level 5 qualifications, but who are not able to lead and work within the sector. We see problems with not being able to understand basic observations and documentations, major gaps in their understanding of child development. I was shocked and surprised that it is an option to opt out of the module in terms of engaging with parents. So while there are many people really trying to do a good job, there is a major issue in terms of a reform of the vocational qualification system. We've always had a very strong history going back many years in terms of our cross-border relationships and learning from each other and working together in terms of especially dealing with some of the legacy of the conflict and the past. And I suppose it wouldn't be natural for us not to worry about the consequences of Brexit, because as I've said, not only has the European Union through the Peace Programme invested heavily in early childhood professional development, but also through the many wonderful Erasmus programmes and indeed Horizon in terms of our research. So that is a worry. I said we hadn't had a comprehensive childcare policy since 1998, but we had a learning to learn policy. And again, many of us in this room have the scars to show from it. Because initially it was to be a 0 to 6 strategy. But I think there were so many tensions and conflicts and indeed professional rivalries that the Department of Education eventually had to water what was in the 0 to 6 policy down. Now there is a solid focus in there. I think it has led to many improvements, but I think it also was a reflection of our divided system and the tensions within that system. I mentioned new decade, new approach, a possibility with no pressure on Oliver here in the room from DE on a new childcare policy, and indeed opportunities through the Prosperity Fund, the replacement of the European Social Fund, and thankfully Peace Plus, the European Union, has agreed to support us on a multi-annual basis for the next number of years, next 6 years, we think. So, in spite, and maybe indeed because of the lack of a top-down policy, I would propose that we in the voluntary sector had to take and think about our influences from elsewhere, and we've used those to shape thinking both within the sector, between the state and the voluntary sector, and also used it to hopefully build the thinking around what our policy framework. And I start first of all with the general comment number 7, falling out of the commitment to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that comment was issued because the UN recognised that state parties were not giving enough attention to the development of a holistic approach to early childhood care and development, not giving enough attention to this period, this first period of childhood, 0 to 8, weren't giving enough attention to programme standards and professional training. But for us in the sector, it is really a strong vehicle to advocate for investment in quality, investment in children's rights, and investment in a professional workforce strategy. Our other influences, again from OECD and the systematic review of early childhood services from the Starting Strong policy recommendations. And again, you can see that focus on a participatory approach to quality improvement, not a top-down, a regulated approach, but an approach that involves those of us who are working in practice with those of us who are regulating and developing quality. And an appropriate training and working conditions for the sector. We could have a whole separate session on the recognition or lack of recognition in terms of pay and status. Another key influence for us in the sector has been the development of the social pedagogical tradition, mainly in Northern Europe, but a tradition which again I will argue that in the 30s we held here in Northern Ireland, where teachers, vocational workers, leisure time pedagogues and others train together first and get their professional development in an integrated and coherent way before they either follow a stronger academic route or a vocational route or working with older children or specialising with for children with special needs. We would argue that that's what is needed here in Northern Ireland, and it's one of the ways that we think we'll overcome some of those tensions. And you know, a social pedagogue is immersed in the rights of the child, is immersed in play, is confident enough to talk and describe what quality looks like, and is able to negotiate with regulators and inspectors a dialogue around quality, is not fearful or dancing to the tune of what inspectors want to see in early childhood services. Matthias is not here, and in a way I'm a bit glad, because he would be saying I'm stealing some of his thunder, but this piece of work, the competency approach to early childhood care and development that Matthias, Michelle van der Broek and Jan Peters were involved in, has also very much influenced our thinking and the way we've been developing our work. And the broad consensus, and it's not new, it's not rocket science, that came out of that core work was that the quality of early childhood education and care, and ultimately outcomes for children and families, and especially for disadvantaged, depend on well-educated, experienced and competent staff. Now it's a no-brainer, and I just don't know why we don't get that. You know, why, and I was talking to somebody at coffee break, you know, if a young person doesn't get their choice in a course and then they're told, well, you can go to her or childcare, you know, it just beggars belief. But, you know, the core work also, you know, helped us think about, you know, not just basic qualification, but building individual competence, both at the individual and individual institution and systems level. You know, rethinking in-service training and what that looked like, really focusing on building a pathway of tertiary education for those who come in as unqualified. This idea, you know, we were delighted to see this idea of having pedagogical support inside and outside the setting to really mentor and further develop good quality, but to really focus on where there were issues with quality and help practitioners really develop reflective, action-oriented skills. And indeed, you know, that, you know, within a system that is professionally led, then communities of learners could take responsibility for their own learning and development. CORE talked about the importance of male workers. We are failing miserably in attracting, supporting, remunerating male workforce here in Northern Ireland, and I think in the rest of the UK. And using, you know, the influences of CORE, we were able to influence educational policy here, at least within the preschool sector, to demand that all those working with the 3 to 4 year olds would have recognised time away for children, now up to 5 days, with non-contact time, paid to further develop their knowledge and skills in working with young children and their families. I share with you the European structure on a quality framework, and again, it makes me so sad, and I'm just going to admit that I didn't support Brexit, but it makes me so sad that we lobbied for so long for the European Union to take and be able to have a focus on young children that was not linked to economic objectives, and just when it did, we're in danger of not benefiting from the framework. They have talked about the need to develop a competence system, and within that competence system, workforce, the appropriate training and qualification and ongoing professional development of the workforce, plus the right terms and conditions, are an essential ingredient, but only one of the ingredients that would make the whole thing work. There needs to be governance and funding, an appropriate curriculum, and again, that's a sore point for us here in Northern Ireland. We had an opportunity 2 years ago to review what is really an outdated preschool curriculum, and we balked at it. We don't have a curriculum for the 0 to 6 age group that's integrated. So, that has been a critically important influencer for us, and indeed the recommendations that came out of the Council on High Quality Early Childhood Education and Care and what that should look like last year, with again this, as a number 2 priority, the support for the professionalisation of the workforce and the development of a coherent system. And they've committed within the multi-annual framework that is being negotiated at the moment, funding that will include opportunities in Erasmus, Horizon, the structural and investment funds, and for us within Peace Plus, we see that there will be an opportunity to fund some of these recommendations over the next period. We've also been seriously involved in and delighted with the commitments within the Sustainable Development Goals, especially Goal 4, the commitment to quality education and all that that means in terms of support for the workforce. But again, here in Northern Ireland, the link between Goal 4 and Goal 16, a commitment to a peace, just and strong society with strong, coherent institutions. Our organisation have, over the more than 60 years of our history and over the 30 years of the peace process, been very committed to seeing the important role that early childhood education and care and the workforce plays in building a society. And I think this framework forces us to look both inside and outside the family in terms of the impact of trauma on children and families. But the theoretical framework really positions the early childhood workforce in terms of a contributor to not just Goal 4 and Goal 16, but all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I know the jury's out in terms of how we're doing. We're 5 years in. The Republic of Ireland have just reported doing well in some areas, but we're a little bit hidden within the UK report. And I would urge you all to do as much as you can to make this a living document and a living reality for those that you work with. The literature then, again, it reinforces what I said earlier on. If we're to deliver, we need a solid, strong, competent, well-qualified, professional workforce. I thought I would share something that is very new for us here in Northern Ireland, but again, I was delighted to see it published. And again, I think it has been part of the advocacy work that we have been involved in over many years. Most of you will know that we're still in Northern Ireland, not just a divided care education split, but a divided education system in terms of religion. The recent policy thrust and act in terms of shared education and working towards perhaps maybe in the future a fuller integrated system is welcome. But one of the key comments from that document said that teachers, and they're alluding to preschool as well as primary school teachers, should have an understanding of their own identity and culture as well as the identity and cultures of those who they're working with. The range of learning should encourage the understanding of feelings and emotions in ourselves as teachers and educators, and what we need to do to influence and build peaceful and positive relationships, mutual understanding, recognising, appreciating and accepting cultural diversity. So that's a welcome and important document for us as educators. But what do we need? What do we need if we're going to really transform what is not a competent system, which is dysfunctional in many ways, and which is wasteful of resources that perhaps we don't have anymore. And my argument would be that we should use this opportunity to transform policy and funding and to create a competent system through systems of governance and leadership. And first of all, we definitely need a coherent early childhood care and education policy for Northern Ireland. And we hope, that we're ready for that. The new decade, new deal will allow for that to happen. We also feel that we need to root that within legislation, and we need an Early Childhood Care and Education Act. We feel that the time is right to fully integrate early childhood services under the one government department. And we are really delighted that the Department of Education has taken such a leadership role. There are still some things that I think need to be brought across. And I suppose the main thing is we can no longer afford a dual system of regulation and inspection. It's wasteful, it's confusing, and it has further led to this continued split between 0 to 3, 3 to 4, education and care, where is play, all of that. We need a new curriculum for the first stage of childhood, and we definitely need a strategic, integrated approach to qualifications and, along with that, status and pay. And I really do think that a workforce strategy, a professional workforce strategy, is long overdue, and indeed is timely. And coupled with that, an approach to long-term professional development, which includes all of those other things that happen outside the classroom but are as important for inside the classroom. And we could have another whole seminar on funding, but we do need a coherent financial strategy, and a common funding formula for children. Like, it's no longer acceptable that just depending on where you are in the system, you're funded in a different way. And you know what? Those in the voluntary and independent sector those children are still being less funded than those in the state sector, and it's no longer fair or justifiable. So, and these are my own views and up for discussion and debate and whatever later on. But in terms of transforming the professional workforce, first of all, I think we need to agree a solid theoretical foundation with ongoing professional development, and the opportunity for us all to train together, whether we end up going through an academic or a vocational route. I think the other important point is that we must start recruiting on the basis of attitude, and then grow the knowledge and skills and competencies. If you don't have the right attitude, you really may forget about it. And we've seen that time and time again. We were just talking about this morning, Pauline and I, people who have come into the sector, committed, open, really, really focused on children and families, and you can grow those people. You can really grow them, but with the wrong attitude, it's sometimes an impossible task. Some of the competences, and I take this from reviews that have been happening across the UK, across Ireland and internationally. I think we all need to be advocates for children's rights and participation. We all need to be rooted within the UN Convention. I was speaking at a conference recently with childminders, and I asked people how many had heard about or been influenced on the UN Convention in their teaching. These were a young, committed workforce, but it hadn't even been touched in terms of the core of the programme. We need competencies that promote the holistic development of children from conception to the end of early childhood. People have to be able to work directly with young children, families, communities, and able to promote the holistic development of children. We now know so much more about children than we did before. There needs to be a clear understanding of executive functioning, resilience, self-regulation, and how we support that. Talked already about the importance of trauma-informed care, but not just rooted within individuals and families, but the whole spectrum, including structural issues affecting trauma. The workforce has to be able to have very strong communication skills, observation and documentation, negotiation, planning for young children that promotes play, early learning, progression and transition. Safeguarding and child protection, we know, is a must. Inclusive practice, cultural competency, and understanding how to work within diverse family situations. Critically important, partnership with our colleagues, with parents and other key professionals, and an ability to embed technology and robotics in our work with children in the classroom and with families. And I think if we looked back, we could create something good for the future. I don't know if many of you have read the 1933 Haddo report, and if you haven't, I think you should. Be your homework from today. It's one of the most inspiring documents, and I notice nodding. To me, it really is one of the most inspiring documents that I ever read. And in reading it, you just get a feel from a government inquiry of how they valued children and those who worked with children. So clear, and they weren't talking about people, oh, we need so-and-so in the baby room with a level 1. They were talking about people who are temperamentally suitable, have a real understanding and respect for children, have a real love of young children, and be a person, and in inverted commas it always was, be a woman of imagination, empathy, understanding and balance. And a recognition that the leader of the setting should be certified. And we were talking then about a certification of 3 years, and if possible, the helper, as they were called, that they should be certified, but an understanding that maybe They wouldn't be certified to the 3-year qualification mark, but they wouldn't be getting a different training experience. They would be getting the same approach as the teacher. And again, a recognition that the teacher would have a responsibility for attending to the physical and mental development. And we see this period as not being 3 to 4 or 3 to 6, but a recognition that children would mainly stay at home at that stage until they were 2, but then the teachers must have been able to work with that age group 2 to 7. That's just a little snippet about what it said about professional qualifications. There's a whole raft of things in there that we could definitely learn from. What the physical design of a building would look like that would support the professional input. And I just thought we have lost so much in the history of the development by subsequently reinventing wheels that are not really fit for purpose. And many of you would also have heard the statement that came out just recently from the National Centre for Social Research, where they were more or less saying, look, for God's sake, what are we worried about, calling people different things and paying them differently? Let's call these people who've all been through the same route to development, who are doing the same job, early years qualified status, and if they are named in that way, then they'll be paid in the same way. This is something that we're trying to do here in Northern Ireland. Have a recognition, at least first of all, that those in the sector who are offering the preschool programme, they're all accountable to the one department, the one curriculum, the one professional recognition. Why can we not treat them in the one way and pay them, in an equal fashion? And then I thought it curtained but end with the quote from Finland, where, and I think most of us in this room recognise that, the Finnish system is really getting it right for teachers, for children and families. And unlike other places in Europe, and unfortunately even here in Northern Ireland and the UK, the teaching profession has lost some of its status. But in Finland, they are a very highly respected profession, equal, they say, to the medical professional. But teachers in Finland are expected to have a master's degree in education with specialisation in research and classroom practice. And indeed, in reading some of this recent analysis of what was happening in Finland, one of the teachers and his early childhood professor said, the role of the teacher in Finland is to keep politicians and the vendors of technology out of the classroom. And they have the confidence to say that. And, again, we at our table, we were talking about the importance of having this autonomy within the profession and confidence to have that bottom-up approach to what we know is right for young children. And in doing so, they've been able to get rid of, constant assessment and screening of children and allow children to develop in an appropriate way and in an appropriate, at an appropriate pace. And then I'm going to leave you with one of my favourites, Bronfenbrenner. And again, this quote from a number of years ago really, I think, sums it up for me in terms of what we should be thinking about in terms of developing and redeveloping the professional workforce. We as a nation need to be re-educated about the necessary conditions for making human beings human, because that's what we're part of. We need to be re-educated, not just as parents, but as workers, as neighbours, friends, members of organisations, committees, boards, informal networks that control our social institutions and therefore determine the conditions of life for our children and families. And I think that's what today is about, thinking about how we can shape, reshape, and together, because I think there's an opportunity now, perhaps for the first time, that those invisible but unnecessary divisions between care and education, between the state and the voluntary and independent and social economy sectors, between academic and vocational worlds, that we can, if we work together, we can break those down and advocate and have a strong voice together on influencing a new workforce strategy for Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Yes. If you would like to stand up, please.
Oh my goodness.
Is that all right? Just say what you have to say.
I'm Anne from Save the Children. Thank you very much, Siobhan. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm just thinking about the Marmot review that came, or report update that came out yesterday, and about health inequalities getting worse, actually for the first time in 100 years or something terrible, and reminding us that some of the key determinants, social determinants of health, start from early childhood development, early childhood development, emphasis on that, and on a good standard of living. And I'm just thinking of the Finnish system with its focus on creating an equal society and realising the lowest level of child poverty in the OECD countries, the narrowest gap in education outcomes between rich and poor children. So it's focused on, as you were describing, an excellent holistic early childhood service, and characterised, by that not to 7 really, not starting primary school to 7, having the master's level you were talking about, having equal status to medicine, but I was told that actually it's harder to get into teaching than it is in medicine or law, and that level of trust and value given to teach their autonomy and so on. I was just wondering, how do you think we actually get to that when the emphasis is on the fourth industrial revolution, the importance of really highly skilled, to meet the demands of a totally new world? How do you get back to that passion? The Finnish system, the emphasis on crafts, on arts, as well as the future. I just think we've such a hard way to turn around a system that's focused on A levels, university, and on that digital future. I just wanted to get your advice on how we actually get there.
And it's a bit like the Swedish system. There has been, a long, a shorter term actually in Finland, but there has been political commitment and then subsequent policy reform and funding. Now we, as you know, have suffered from a lot of lack of political institutions to support over the long term. But I think there's power in this room and elsewhere, and I think willingness to listen in Northern Ireland in terms of what we could do to make things better for children. I think we have an advantage in that we're separate by the Irish Sea from the rest of the UK, and an opportunity to develop our own system. But we all have to be advocates for children. We have to, we all know this in this room and beyond. We have the bucket loads of research in terms, if you get it right for young children and their families, if you do the right things, you will have the long-term returns on investment. And we don't have the money to continue doing the wrong things, and we know we're doing the wrong things for children, but we as advocates really need to have clear messages and agreed messages. Like I refer back to our Learning to Learn policy, and there were a variety of reasons why we were not a united front and not able to get the 0 to 6 policy. But I think we need, as a sector, need to learn from that, because there had been willingness to do something more radical. I think we let ourselves down in not being coherent enough in terms of what that would look like. But it's like, God, they of all people have been long enough around to know it's not easy. But I really do feel there is an opportunity at the moment in terms of the new executive. You know, childcare and early education, it's not, you know, maybe the top priority. It was before the executive fell, but I think there's enough commitment in there. There's enough evidence. There are enough issues that we know that we could address by investing properly, that we should be able to get it across the line. And indeed we have the opportunities. We haven't much money in the system in Northern Ireland, but there are opportunities through Peace Plus.
Do you think there's enough to say that the early years are a priority? Therefore, you know, the evidence shows that they are.
Absolutely.
Tackling them. Then other people will say, but look, there's, you're not really tackling the real problems here about the duplication of services, the academic selection, the waste of resources. Is it enough to reiterate that message and say the academic research shows the priority should be given to early years, or should we be also talking about those other
Of
barriers?
course there are other structural reforms,
yeah.
but you know, I think there isn't another area of research with such rich evidence about how effective we can be if we do it right for young children and their families. But of course, you know, another pet platform of mine is we're doing it wrong for children entering formal school age at 4. We know that. We could save resources and get better outcomes if we did something different. We know the evidence is stacked up against academic selection, but I think for us, if we can get it right in the early years, you know, there are a lot of things that would flow from that. A member of staff in Reggio, you know, would always say to us, I can't understand you guys. If you were building a house, you wouldn't start on the 6th floor. You know, why just can you not agree that we know enough to support the first 1,000 days and all that happens in that first stage of early childhood, and use that as our argument? That's how they did it in places like Finland and Sweden and places like New Zealand. New Zealand was as fractured as we are, and now with a coherent policy, before 5 policy that was established in 1990, and you know, a commitment across many political parties over the last 30 years, they are creating a much more coherent early childhood system with a focus, and I thought it was very brave of them in New Zealand, a focus of retraining everybody. The teacher of the qualified teacher status, as well as the professional within the preschool group, the home-based daycare, they all had to commit to a system of getting 30 points professional credit every year over a long period of time. And that has generated a very good integrated system within New Zealand.